In a tranquil small town, Judge Aaron Miles reflects on a successful community fundraiser filled with hope and purpose. His drive home is serene, marked by thoughts of family and the joy of making a difference. But this peace is shattered when he's pulled over by a police officer. What should be a routine traffic stop quickly escalates into a tense confrontation steeped in prejudice and suspicion. As Judge Miles fights to maintain his composure against the weight of bias, he finds himself not only defending his position but confronting the harsh realities of being a black man in America. This powerful story highlights the fragility of justice and the struggle for dignity in the face of discrimination. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Judge Aaron Miles sat comfortably behind the wheel of his car, the gentle hum of the engine creating a low, steady rhythm that accompanied the tranquil evening. The atmosphere was peaceful, the kind of serene quiet that envelopes small towns late at night when the majority of the population has retreated into the warmth of their homes. He had just attended a community fundraiser aimed at supporting underprivileged youth, an event that had exceeded his expectations. During the evening, he delivered a heartfelt speech focused on themes of hope, perseverance, and justice, issues that resonated deeply with him, both in his personal life and his professional role as a judge. He had lingered after his speech, engaging in conversations with attendees, savoring the palpable sense of unity and purpose that filled the air. As he drove through the nearly deserted streets, the warm glow of streetlights cast elongated shadows that danced across the asphalt. With a sense of relief, he loosened his tie, allowing himself a fleeting moment of relaxation. His thoughts drifted to his family, his wife and children, who were likely already tucked in bed at home. A smile spread across his face, filling him with a profound sense of contentment. Such moments were rare in his busy life, providing a precious opportunity to unwind, reflect, and appreciate the remarkable journey that had brought him from his humble beginnings to the esteemed position of one of the youngest judges ever appointed in the state. Just as he reached for the radio to play some music, the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights suddenly illuminated his rearview mirror. The serene smile that had adorned his face vanished in an instant, replaced by a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He quickly glanced at the speedometer, relieved to see that he was well within the speed limit and that his car was in perfect working order. There was no apparent reason for him to be pulled over, yet the lights continued to flash insistently, demanding his immediate attention. With a soft sigh, Judge Miles signaled and maneuvered his car to the side of the road. His thoughts raced momentarily, but he steeled himself with a deep breath, reminding himself that he had done nothing wrong. This was likely just a routine stop. However, years of experience had taught him that encounters like these could often be unpredictable, especially for someone like him, a black man driving alone at night. As the police cruiser came to a stop behind him, he reached for his wallet, carefully extracting both his driver's license and his judicial identification card. He had learned from numerous accounts and personal experiences that it was always best to have everything prepared in advance, minimizing any potential for misunderstanding. Keeping his hands in clear view of the steering wheel, he waited, heart pounding slightly in his chest. In the rearview mirror, he noticed the officer exiting the patrol car, striding briskly towards him. The officer was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark uniform that seemed to meld with the night. His expression was stern, eyes narrowed as if he had already formed a suspicion about the man sitting in the driver's seat. Judge Miles exhaled slowly, the breath escaping him like a quiet sigh of resignation as he prepared for the unfolding encounter. The officer approached his car, knocking firmly on the window. Miles rolled it down with a smooth, deliberate motion, allowing the cool night air to drift in. It carried a sudden tension that clung to the atmosphere like a thick fog, heightening his awareness. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, his tone clipped and sharp, cutting through the stillness of the night. Miles shook his head, maintaining a calm demeanor. "No, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice was steady and polite, a tone he had meticulously honed in the courtroom, especially when navigating the sensitive waters of high-stakes cases. The officer did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes moved methodically, scanning the interior of the car with quick, practiced glances as if assessing the situation for any signs of trouble. After a moment, he returned his focus to Judge Miles, his brow furrowing slightly as though he were piecing together a complex puzzle. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his words blunt, leaving no room for pleasantries or small talk. Without hesitation, Judge Miles retrieved his documents, placing them into the officer's outstretched hand. "Here's my license, registration, and my identification. I'm Judge Aaron Miles," he stated. Feeling an undercurrent of tension simmer beneath the surface, the officer didn't immediately examine the documents. Instead, he lingered on Judge Miles, assessing him as if searching for something hidden just below the surface. Finally, he took the papers, flipping through them quickly. Although his expression remained neutral, there was a slight pause when he came across the judicial identification card. He glanced at it for just a second longer than necessary before returning it along with the rest of the documents. "You're a judge, huh?" the officer remarked, his voice tinged with disbelief as if the very idea of a judge being in this position was absurd. "Yes, I am," Miles replied, maintaining his composure, though he could feel the conversation veering into a territory he had encountered far too often. It was a skepticism he had learned to recognize, a polite facade layered over an undercurrent of doubt and bias. "Where are you headed tonight, Judge?" the officer inquired, but the way he emphasized the word judge made it sound less like a title and more like a taunt. "I'm headed home. I just left a community event downtown," Miles responded, trying to steer the conversation back to a straightforward exchange, hoping to diffuse any rising tension. However, the officer leaned in slightly, as if the closer proximity would somehow elicit a more truthful response. "A community event?" he echoed, his eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Do you mind stepping out of the car for a minute?" Judge Miles blinked in surprise, caught off guard by the sudden escalation of the situation. He hadn't expected this. A routine stop usually concluded with an explanation or perhaps a minor citation, not a directive to exit the vehicle. Yet, he had learned long ago that complying with police requests, regardless of how unnecessary they seemed, was often the safest course of action. "Of course," he said, although a faint unease began to settle in the pit of his stomach. He opened the door and stepped out, deliberately keeping his hands visible, careful to avoid any sudden movements that might be misinterpreted. The officer took a step back, his hand resting casually on the holster of his weapon, a gesture that was not lost on Miles. He had seen that move before and heard it echoed in countless testimonies from defendants who had found themselves in similarly precarious situations. What began as a simple traffic stop was rapidly morphing into something far more dangerous. As he stood beside his car, the officer motioned for him to move to the front of the vehicle. "Stand right here," he ordered with an air of authority. Miles complied, positioning himself in front of the car where the headlights cast a stark, unforgiving light upon him, making him feel suddenly exposed and vulnerable. He could sense the officer's eyes on him, scrutinizing him as if he were a suspect in a crime that had yet to be committed. "What's this all about?" Miles inquired, keeping his voice level, though he could feel the tension creeping into his bones. He understood instinctively that this situation had transcended a mere traffic violation. It had taken on an insidious nature. The officer remained silent, taking a step back, his skepticism palpable as he regarded Judge Miles with an intensity that made the air feel thick. "You sure this ID is real?" he asked, holding up the judicial identification card as if it were a counterfeit trinket, something unworthy of his attention. Judge Miles felt a flash of frustration rise within him, but he pushed it down, forcing himself to remain composed. "It's real. I've been a judge in this county for nearly 10 years, he stated, emphasizing his years of service and dedication. The officer's expression remained hard, unconvinced, as he replied, "You don't look like a judge." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, laden with unspoken assumptions and biases. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Miles held his ground, meeting the officer's gaze with unwavering resolve. He could feel the familiar weight of prejudice settling over the encounter, turning what should have been a simple traffic stop into an uncomfortable confrontation steeped in doubt and discrimination. The officer's suspicion had shifted from concerns about legality to an unsettling perception of who deserved to hold power and who did not. Judge Aaron Miles felt acutely aware that this was not a battle he could win through dialogue or reason. Thus, he chose to remain silent, bracing himself to gauge just how far this officer would go in his unwarranted scrutiny. The night air felt heavy and oppressive as he stood beside his car, enveloped in the harsh, glaring light of the headlights. Although his heartbeat was steady, it had quickened with an instinctive awareness of the tension in the air. What should have been a simple, fleeting interaction had morphed into a deeply troubling confrontation. "Where are you coming from?" Officer Mike Reynolds repeated, his tone now more abrasive and confrontational, as if the title of judge held no significance for him at all. He leaned slightly closer, his hand resting with deliberate intent on his belt. That gesture, though subtle, spoke volumes to Judge Miles. It was an unspoken threat, a chilling reminder of who truly wielded power in this moment. "I told you, officer. I'm coming from a community event. It was a fundraiser for local youth," Judge Miles replied, striving to keep his voice calm and steady. Yet, each word felt laden with the weight of the situation. He understood that anything he said could either defuse the escalating tension or ignite it further. Years spent navigating the complexities of the courtroom had equipped him with invaluable skills in managing tense situations, but this encounter was strikingly different. In the courtroom, he commanded authority and commanded respect, buoyed by the law that upheld his position. Here, on the darkened side of a desolate road, he was reduced to being just another black man facing the intense skepticism of a white officer. Officer Reynolds narrowed his eyes as if weighing something intangible in his mind, deliberating whether Judge Miles was sharing the truth or merely spinning a tale. His expression was a mask of barely concealed suspicion, and although he didn't articulate it outright, his body language spoke volumes. He didn't believe Miles. "A fundraiser, huh?" the officer remarked, his tone dripping with thinly veiled sarcasm, as if the mere notion of a man like Aaron Miles participating in a positive community event was utterly absurd. Judge Miles shifted his stance slightly, keeping his hands visible at all times, a precaution learned from countless stories of similar encounters. "Yes, a fundraiser," he reiterated, though his patience was wearing thin. He understood the stakes and knew he couldn't afford to let his emotions get the best of him. He had seen how quickly such encounters could spiral out of control. He had read about it, watched videos of others who had faced similar hostility, and listened to the heart-wrenching stories shared by members of his community. Only they weren't judges. They lacked the shield of a title that might have otherwise afforded them some protection on a night like this. Reynolds straightened his posture, finally withdrawing his hand from his belt, yet the look etched on his face conveyed to Miles that this tense exchange was far from over. "Do you mind if I take a look inside your car, Judge?" The way he emphasized the word "judge" was laced with incredulity, as though he found it entertaining to consider that the man standing before him was a legitimate figure of authority. A pang of frustration shot through Miles. "Is that necessary, officer? I've already provided my identification," he responded, striving to sound reasonable and calm, though he could feel the tension beginning to rise again. "Look, I'm just doing my job," the officer retorted, though his tone carried little of the understanding he claimed to embody. "You don't have anything to hide, do you?" Miles took a deliberate deep breath, recognizing that he was being cornered into a situation he hadn't invited. "No, I don't have anything to hide. However, I would like to understand what exactly this is about. I haven't done anything wrong." The words emerged measured and deliberate, yet a hint of indignation broke through the facade. The officer's eyes narrowed once more, scanning Judge Miles's face in search of any sign of deceit, any indication that he was not who he claimed to be. "Just relax, Judge. You're not under arrest. I just want to ensure everything is in order." "It's protocol," Reynolds stated, though the insincerity dripped from his words, rendering the assurance hollow. "If it's just protocol, then I expect to be treated with the same respect that I would show you," Miles replied, maintaining a steady tone. The weight of the moment pressed down upon him, yet he remained resolute, determined not to let fear dictate his actions. Sure," the officer muttered, his gaze flicking back toward the patrol car as if he were silently calling for backup. But Judge Miles noticed the slight flicker of uncertainty that betrayed him, a crack in the officer's confident facade. Standing tall and resolute amidst the encroaching night, Judge Miles was determined not to allow this moment, however charged with tension, to define him. He had spent a lifetime advocating for justice and equality, and he refused to let the biases of a single man overshadow all he had worked for. As the officer moved back toward the car, a surge of determination coursed through Miles. This was not merely a traffic stop. It was a pivotal moment that encapsulated the struggles and triumphs of his entire life. A life dedicated to fighting against prejudice and for the rights of others. The night was still young, and so was his unwavering fight for dignity, both for himself and for those who had come before him, who had paved the way through adversity. When the officer opened the car door, Judge Miles inhaled deeply, bracing himself for the challenges that lay ahead. He was ready to face whatever scrutiny would come his way, firm in his resolve to uphold his integrity and honor. This officer was not merely performing a routine check. He was testing Miles, pushing him to see if he would falter or make a misstep. "Go ahead," Miles finally said, his voice tight, each word heavy with reluctance. The hatred for those words washed over him as they escaped his lips, but he recognized the lack of options. The officer was determined to search his vehicle regardless of Miles' consent. Any resistance could escalate the situation in ways that might prove dangerous. Officer Reynolds nodded curtly and approached the car with an air of authority. Judge Miles watched as the officer methodically opened the door, beginning a search that felt both invasive and unwarranted. The search was quick, bordering on perfunctory. Miles knew there was nothing to find beyond his briefcase, a few scattered papers, and a coat draped casually over the back seat. Yet, Reynolds took his time, scrutinizing every nook and cranny, checking the glove compartment, peering under the seats, and even rifling through the contents of his briefcase. Though none of these items held any significance, the minutes stretched painfully as Miles felt the officer's frustration mounting. After what felt like an eternity, Reynolds finally closed the car door, his frown deepening, clearly unsatisfied with the lack of incriminating evidence to support his suspicion. "Looks like everything checks out," the officer muttered, but his tone remained steely and unyielding. It was evident he was still wrestling with the idea that the man before him did not fit the preconceived notions he held. Judge Miles chose silence in response, recognizing that any attempt to engage further would likely only stoke the officer's mistrust. But Reynolds was not finished. He stepped closer again, narrowing his eyes as if seeking to dissect Miles' very being. "You say you're a judge? I find that hard to believe. Judges don't usually drive around like this, especially not at this hour." The comment dripped with skepticism, one that Miles had encountered countless times throughout his life. Yet, never before had it been so brazenly stated. It carried an unmistakable undercurrent of disbelief, implying that a black man could not possibly hold such a prestigious position. This disbelief was an unwelcome companion he had faced when he first stepped into law school, when he successfully passed the bar exam, and even on the day he was sworn in as a judge. Regardless of the years he had dedicated to proving himself or the complex cases he had presided over, to Officer Reynolds, he simply did not fit the mold of a judge, and that alone was enough to cast doubt on everything else. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Judge Miles straightened his shoulders, drawing on every ounce of composure he possessed. "I've been a judge in this county for nearly 10 years, officer," he replied, his voice steady yet edged with the rising tide of indignation. "I've handled cases that are far more complicated than this interaction. Right now, I'm simply trying to get home, and I can't understand why we're still having this conversation." Reynolds smirked an expression that sent a chill through Miles with its dismissiveness. "A judge, huh? Sure, doesn't seem like it," he retorted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The weight of the accusation hung heavily between them, palpable and suffocating. For the first time that night, a sharp pang of anger ignited in Miles' chest. He understood the need for caution and the importance of following procedure, But this officer's intentions were clear. He was not interested in the truth. He had already made up his mind about who Judge Miles was, and no amount of explanation or evidence would alter that preconceived notion. Reynolds glanced down at the documents in his hand one last time before addressing Judge Miles again. "I'm going to run these through the system just to be sure. You stay right here." With that, he turned and walked back toward his cruiser. Judge Miles took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions surging within him. He understood that this was more than just a simple traffic stop. It felt like a test, a challenge to see how far Officer Reynolds was willing to go to validate his own biases, to assert the belief that Miles, despite his accomplishments, didn't truly belong in the role he had earned through hard work and dedication. As the minutes ticked by, Judge Miles stood beside his car, his body rigid with frustration. Through the windshield of the cruiser, he could see Reynolds typing something into the onboard computer, his fingers moving methodically. The silence of the night had grown louder around him, the gentle rustle of the trees and the distant hum of traffic the only sounds cutting through the thick tension. A car passed by slowly, its occupants craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the unfolding scene. In a small town late at night, any interaction with the police seemed to attract attention. Judge Miles noticed one of the passengers pull out a phone, perhaps to capture a photo or a video of the incident. It served as a stark reminder that this encounter could easily become public, a fresh entry in the long list of black men who had been stopped by law enforcement for no justifiable reason. Judge Miles had devoted his entire career to combating the systemic injustices that plagued people of color in this country, and now, he found himself becoming yet another statistic, another example of racial profiling at its most blatant. He recalled the countless cases of young men who hadn't been as fortunate as he was, young men ensnared by a system that deemed them unworthy, simply because they didn't conform to someone else's narrow definition of success or because of the color of their skin. As the minutes dragged on, Miles came to realize that this was no longer merely about getting home. It had evolved into a matter of principle. He couldn't allow this moment to define him, nor could he permit Officer Reynolds to walk away believing that his actions were in any way justified. Standing beside his car, hands resting calmly by his sides yet every muscle in his body tense, he felt the night grow colder, the chill seeping through the fabric of his suit as he awaited whatever check Reynolds was conducting. Deep down, he sensed that the officer was stalling, searching for any flimsy excuse to prolong this charade. This situation had transcended the legal realm if it had ever truly existed within it. This was about power, control, and the unspoken assumptions the officer had made the instant he spotted a black man behind the wheel of an expensive car late at night. The police cruiser's flashing lights served as an ominous beacon of authority, only intensifying the weight of the moment. Judge Miles glanced around, noticing a small gathering forming just a block away. Two more bystanders had pulled out their phones, documenting the incident from a distance. Even without the full context, they could sense that something was amiss. He shifted his weight, attempting to shake off the growing frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Throughout his career as a judge, he honed his ability to master his emotions, maintaining a calm and impartial demeanor regardless of how heated the situation became. But this felt different. At this moment, he was no longer in control. He wasn't in a courtroom, standing at the bench wielding the authority to command respect and dispense justice. Instead, on the side of a dimly lit road, he was just another black man being unjustly interrogated. The events had unfolded so rapidly. The stop, the barrage of questions, the escalating suspicion. Miles had read countless stories like this and had presided over cases where similar encounters had resulted in devastating consequences. He thought of the young men whose lives had been irrevocably altered by a single moment with law enforcement. The faces of those he had tried to help in his courtroom flickered through his mind like ghosts haunting his thoughts. Taking a slow, deep breath, he reminded himself that he had to remain calm. Losing his temper would only provide Officer Reynolds with more justification to escalate the situation. He couldn't afford to let that happen. Not tonight. Inside the police cruiser, Reynolds continued to tap away at the computer, his expression concealed from view. The delay in confirming Miles's identity was far beyond what was necessary. The officer already had all the information he required: his driver's license, registration, and judicial identification. This was nothing more than a power play, a means for Reynolds to assert his dominance. A few more agonizing minutes passed in silence before Officer Reynolds finally emerged from the cruiser, his face still unreadable. He walked slowly toward Judge Miles, the weight of his authority palpable in every deliberate step. In his hand, he held a pair of handcuffs, a chilling symbol of the power he wielded at that moment. Miles stiffened, his heart skipping a beat as a wave of disbelief washed over him. He had steeled himself for a long, frustrating encounter, but he never anticipated this. Handcuffs? He echoed, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, Officer Reynolds commanded, his voice steady yet cold, devoid of empathy. Judge Miles blinked in disbelief, momentarily frozen in place as the gravity of the situation settled in. Excuse me? His voice, although calm, carried a sharp edge of incredulity that he could not suppress. You heard me. Turn around. Hands behind your back, Reynolds repeated, stepping closer, the authority in his tone unmistakable. A small crowd had gathered a short distance away, their whispers escalating into a chorus of confusion and outrage. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, many of them pulling out their phones to record the unfolding drama from across the street, capturing every moment as it transpired. What's the charge? Miles asked, striving to keep his voice measured even as anger began to simmer beneath the surface. This had spiraled far beyond a simple traffic stop. This was nothing less than a gross abuse of power. Failure to comply with an officer's orders, Reynolds replied, his gaze unwavering, unyielding, and providing false identification. Miles felt a surge of disbelief wash over him. False identification? I provided my real name and my real ID. I have been nothing but cooperative since this stop began. The words tumbled out, laden with frustration. But none of that mattered to Reynolds. The officer had already made up his mind about Miles, and no amount of truth would alter that conviction. False identification? Miles repeated, his voice dangerously low, the heat of anger seeping into his tone. You've seen my ID. You know who I am. Reynolds remained silent, his expression hardening as he reached for Judge Miles's arm, yanking it behind his back with unnecessary force. Miles tensed instinctively as the sharp bite of the handcuff snapped around his wrists. It wasn't the first time he had seen handcuffs up close. He had watched countless defendants in similar situations, sitting in his courtroom and sharing how a single encounter had upended their lives. Yet this was the first time he had ever felt those cuffs on himself. As the cold metal locked into place, something inside him shifted, a jarring realization that brought a rush of anger at the injustice of it all. I can't believe this is happening, Miles said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. I'm a judge. Yeah, well, that doesn't matter right now, Reynolds retorted, tightening the cuffs just a fraction too much, a display of power that felt personal. I have my orders. As he began to lead Miles toward the police cruiser, the crowd's reaction intensified. Voices rose in a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. What's going on? Why are you arresting him? One woman shouted, her voice sharp with indignation, cutting through the tension in the air. The flash of camera phones illuminated the scene, capturing every moment like strobe lights in a dark room. He's a judge, another voice chimed in, echoing the sentiment of disbelief that rippled through the crowd. For a moment, Officer Reynolds hesitated, the weight of the onlookers pressing down on him. It was clear that the situation was spiraling beyond his control, and he could feel the tide turning against him. In that instant, Judge Miles understood that this moment was about far more than just him. It encapsulated the countless others who had faced similar situations, those who had been treated like criminals simply for existing in a world that often refused to see them for who they truly were. Reynolds hesitated, but then he resumed leading Miles to the cruiser, the crowd's collective outrage echoing around them. It was a small act of defiance against the system, a statement that spoke to the brokenness of the structures in place. Yet Judge Miles refused to let this encounter end with him being just another statistic, another case lost in the annals of injustice. No, this was his moment to fight back, to demonstrate that he would not be silenced or diminished by the actions of one officer who thought he could strip away his dignity. As they approached the cruiser, Miles's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up against a system that needed change. He felt a surge of determination rises within him. He would not let this moment define him. Instead, he would use it as fuel to ignite a broader conversation about accountability, justice, and the inherent dignity that every individual deserves. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As they approached the police cruiser, Judge Aaron Miles squared his shoulders, resolutely determined to hold his head high. He steeled himself to face whatever might come next, armed with the grace and strength that had carried him through countless trials. "I will fight this," he declared, his voice firm and unwavering. At that moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Officer Mike Reynolds' face, a brief glimpse of doubt that suggested he might reconsider his actions. Yet it was too late for him to back down. He had already crossed a line, and Miles was resolved not to let him escape the consequences. As the officer shoved him into the back of the cruiser, a swell of voices erupted from the crowd gathered nearby, a sea of protest rising to the night sky. Miles felt a surge of hope wash over him. He was not alone in this struggle. As he glanced at the onlookers, he saw faces filled with anger, concern, and a shared understanding of the injustices they had all witnessed. This was not just his battle. It represented a pivotal moment for change, for awareness, and for standing up against the injustices that had long been endured in silence by so many. With that empowering thought resonating in his mind, Miles leaned back against the cool metal of the cruiser, determined to make this moment count. He was ready to confront whatever lay ahead, fully aware that this was only the beginning of his fight for justice, not just for himself, but for all those who had been silenced by the very system that was supposed to protect them. The scene unfolding outside the window felt surreal, akin to watching a nightmare in slow motion. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Not after all the hard work and dedication he had poured into his career. Yet, here he was, handcuffed in the back of a police cruiser, feeling no different from the countless defendants who had appeared before him in court, seeking justice and fair treatment. As he sat confined in the back seat, thoughts of his family flooded his mind, his wife and his children. What would they think when they heard about this incident? Would they see the video that was surely making its rounds online, capturing this humiliating moment? Would they experience the same disbelief and helplessness that engulfed him now? The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He had to focus on the present. This battle was not yet over. From the front seat, Officer Reynolds started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through the cabin, a sound that felt both ominous and oppressive. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes briefly locking with Judge Miles' reflection. "You're making a big mistake," Miles said, his voice calm yet laced with an undercurrent of warning. "When this is all over, you'll come to understand the weight of what you've done." Reynolds didn't respond, instead shifting the car into gear and pulling away from the side of the road. The red and blue lights continued to flash, slicing through the darkness of the night as they drove toward the station, illuminating the path ahead with an unsettling clarity. Judge Miles stared out the window, watching the familiar sights of the town blur past him like a fleeting dream. The weight of the handcuffs around his wrists served as a constant reminder of the harsh reality he now faced. Throughout his life, he had fought tirelessly for justice, advocating for the rights of those who had been wrongfully accused or mistreated by the very system that was meant to protect them. Yet now, for the first time, he found himself on the other side of that system, and the irony was almost unbearable. The car's interior was shrouded in an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the distant crackle of the police radio. Miles closed his eyes for a moment, striving to center himself and push away the anger and frustration that threatened to consume him. He had to stay focused. He needed clarity of thought to navigate this dire situation. Upon arriving at the station, the harsh fluorescent lights inside the building cast an eerie glow over the dimly lit space. Officer Reynolds parked the cruiser and swung open the back door. He reached in, grabbing Judge Miles by the arm and pulling him out of the car with a roughness that felt completely unnecessary. Inside the station, the atmosphere was quiet at this late hour, with only a handful of officers milling about, most of them blissfully unaware of the storm brewing outside. But as soon as they caught sight of who Reynolds was escorting in, a murmur of recognition rippled through the room. Whispers of disbelief filled the air, mingling with the weight of the moment, as the gravity of the situation began to sink in for everyone present. "Is that Judge Miles?" one of the officers whispered to another, disbelief evident in his voice, a murmur that rippled through the gathered group. As the whispers grew louder, more officers congregated around them, their eyes widening with a mix of confusion and incredulity. They watched intently as Officer Reynolds led Miles toward the booking desk, each step resonating with an undercurrent of tension. This was not a typical arrest, and every officer present sensed it. Judge Miles remained composed, his face a mask of calm, betraying none of the inner turmoil that swirled beneath the surface. He was acutely aware of what awaited him next. The booking process, the photographs, the endless paperwork. It was all part of the system he had spent years overseeing, a system that now felt alien and hostile. Standing on this side of the law, his authority and reputation held no weight. They were rendered meaningless at this moment. As Reynolds prepared to process him, a senior officer, Sergeant Jenkins, stepped forward, brow furrowed in confusion and concern. "Mike, what the hell is going on?" "That's Judge Miles." His voice was a mix of incredulity and disbelief, as if he couldn't fathom what was unfolding before him. Reynolds, unwavering, replied, "I caught him providing false identification. He's resisting the investigation." His words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Jenkins shifted his gaze between Reynolds and Judge Miles, his expression morphing into one of caution. "False identification? Are you serious? That's Aaron Miles. He's been on the bench for almost 10 years. The incredulity in his voice was palpable, echoing the disbelief that was rapidly spreading among the gathered officers. Reynolds shrugged, his face impassive and resolute. "We'll sort it out, but for now, he's under arrest." There was a finality to his words that left little room for negotiation. Jenkins stared at Reynolds for a long moment, weighing the situation before turning back to Judge Miles. "Judge, do you want to make a phone call?" "We can." "I'll wait," Miles interrupted calmly, his voice steady, yet imbued with a quiet strength. He wasn't about to rush through this process, not yet. He understood the gravity of the moment and the significance of standing firm in the face of injustice. Jenkins hesitated, clearly uncertain about how to proceed, but eventually nodded, the lines of concern etching deeper on his forehead. "All right, but this better get sorted out quickly." As they moved through the booking process, Judge Miles' mind churned with thoughts. This situation was no longer just about him. It was about exposing a much larger issue, something that transcended a simple traffic stop. He felt an urgent awareness that the system he had dedicated his life to uphold was not merely broken. It was rigged, and he was living proof of its failures. In the holding cell, Judge Aaron Miles sat quietly, the cold metal bench beneath him a stark contrast to the warmth of the summer night he had left behind. The small room was washed in a dim, sterile light that buzzed faintly overhead, casting long, haunting shadows across the concrete floor. The thick gray walls exuded an oppressive atmosphere, as if the very air inside was weighed down by the indifference of the system that had failed him. Though he had spent years in various jails as part of his duties, this experience was uniquely disorienting. Never before had he been confined as a detainee. His hands, now free from the constricting handcuffs, rested in his lap, though the ache in his wrists served as a painful reminder of the indignity he had just endured. It wasn't the first time Judge Miles had encountered the sting of racism in his life, but this experience was different. It felt raw, public, and intensely personal. The reality of his circumstances settled in, heavy and suffocating. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet determination simmered. He would not be crushed by this moment. He surveyed his surroundings with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years navigating the justice system. The holding cell was standard, small, impersonal, and designed to strip away any sense of individuality from those who entered. In this place, one ceased to be a person. Instead, you became just another detainee, another case number waiting to be processed. Tonight, that number belonged to him. Outside the bars, the station hummed with a frenetic energy. Officers moved in and out of rooms, their voices forming a low murmur that drifted into the cell. Some were aware of who was inside, whispering to one another in hushed tones, their uncertainty palpable. Others went about their business, oblivious to the fact that the man behind the bars was a judge who had once presided over cases like the one he now faced. Miles could hear snippets of conversation drifting through the station, fragments of disbelief and concern. That's the judge, right? What's he doing here? Reynolds arrested him for what? This is going to blow up in all of our faces. He didn't need to catch every word to grasp the implications of their murmurs. He had been a respected figure in the legal community for years, and his arrest was already sending shockwaves through the station. Yet, at this moment, he felt no urgency to explain himself. Not yet. There was a point to be made, a lesson to be taught, and he intended to ensure that it would be heard loud and clear. Judge Miles found himself at a crossroads of power and principle. He could have easily reached for his phone to call his lawyer, invoking his legal authority to demand an audience with the police chief. He had connections, and he knew that with a few well-placed calls, he could have the charges against him dismissed in a heartbeat. Even as he sat there, several officers had approached him, their faces a mixture of concern and eagerness, offering to intervene on his behalf. They wanted to make a few calls, to leverage their influence to clear up this entire situation. But Judge Miles had resolutely declined their offers. He was determined to see this ordeal through to the end. He wanted to fully immerse himself in the reality that so many others had faced. The countless young black men who had stood before him in his courtroom, often resigned to their fate, judged and labeled guilty before they had even spoken a word in their defense. It was imperative for him to understand, to feel, to know firsthand how entrenched the rot in the system truly ran. As he sat there, time seemed to stretch infinitely, the minutes dragging on, morphing into what felt like an entire hour. The police station was eerily quiet for a weekend night. The usual bustle of activity seemed to have been replaced by a heavy stillness. Yet, Miles was acutely aware that at any moment, the atmosphere could shift dramatically. He had no idea how far this would go, but he was steeled for the long haul, ready to endure whatever came next. His thoughts meandered back to his courtroom. The faces of the defendants he had sentenced flooded his mind, many of whom came from backgrounds strikingly similar to his current predicament. How many of them had been treated with the same indignity he was experiencing now, presumed guilty before they could even open their mouths to plead their case? If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps jolted him from his reverie. He looked up to see Officer Jenkins standing on the other side of the bars, an expression of conflict etched on his face, a blend of apology and confusion that was unmistakable. "Judge Miles," Jenkins began, his voice low and tinged with hesitance, "we're working diligently to get this sorted out. This whole situation is, well, to put it mildly, a misunderstanding." Miles met his gaze with a calm yet scrutinizing look, the weight of his position palpable in the air. "A misunderstanding, Sergeant? Is that truly what we're calling it in this instance?" he asked, his tone carefully measured. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, his fingers fidgeting as he rubbed the back of his neck, clearly caught in a web of bureaucracy. "Look, I know this isn't right." Reynolds acted out of line. "Everyone is aware of that. But the truth is, we have to go through the proper channels. You understand how the system works. If you'd like, I can contact the chief. He's already on his way, but I could expedite the process and get you out of here faster." Judge Miles leaned back slightly, his eyes unwavering as they bore into Jenkins's. "I genuinely appreciate the offer, Sergeant, but I have no interest in taking shortcuts. Not tonight, not under these circumstances." Jenkins frowned, his frustration evident. "You don't have to remain here, sir. We can have you out in a matter of minutes if you just let us." "I said I will wait," Miles interjected firmly, his voice authoritative yet not unkind. He wasn't angry with Jenkins. The officer was merely doing his job, attempting to defuse a situation that was rapidly escalating. But that was precisely the point. Miles was determined to expose the truth, to allow the system to reveal itself in all its flawed glory. Jenkins hesitated again, visibly unsure of how to respond. He had never encountered a scenario like this before. A judge voluntarily sitting in a holding cell, refusing to leave even when offered a way out on a silver platter. After a long pause, he finally nodded slowly, acknowledging the judge's steadfastness. "Very well, Judge, but just know that if you decide to change your mind—" "I won't," Miles interrupted once more, his resolve unwavering. With a resigned sigh, Jenkins turned away, leaving Miles alone again in the dimly lit confines of the holding cell. In that solitude, Judge Miles felt an unexpected sense of peace wash over him. This experience was bigger than himself. It transcended his situation. It was about justice, about the undeniable truths that needed to be illuminated, even if it meant enduring the humiliation of his current predicament. He felt a surge of determination swell within him. He would rise from this ordeal, not just unbroken but stronger and more resolute than ever before. He would not allow the system to break him. As time trudged on, the station fell into another heavy silence. Officers occasionally cast glances in the direction of the holding cell, uncertainty etched on their faces as they tried to comprehend the significance of the man sitting inside. Word had circulated quickly, creating an undercurrent of tension that lingered in the air, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath, waiting for the next move in this precarious game. Finally, the door to the station swung open, and in strode Police Chief Nathan Harris, a formidable figure with a tall, broad-shouldered presence, his gray hair neatly combed back, and a stern expression etched across his features. He was accompanied by Officer Jenkins, and together they approached the holding cell. Chief Harris's face bore the lines of frustration and concern, though it was unclear whether his ire was directed at Officer Reynolds, Judge Miles, or the chaotic situation itself. "Judge Miles," Harris said as he approached, his voice low and authoritative, echoing slightly in the sterile atmosphere of the police station. "I'm here to get this sorted out." Miles looked up from his seat, his expression calm but resolute, though his sharp eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "Chief Harris, I figured I'd be seeing you soon," he replied, recognizing the gravity of the situation unfolding before them. Harris let out a slow breath, clearly attempting to keep his emotions in check, a subtle tension radiating from him. "I've already spoken with Officer Reynolds. This whole thing," he gestured vaguely, his hands moving in an arc as if trying to encompass the absurdity and chaos of the situation. "It shouldn't have happened. And yet it did," Miles replied evenly, his tone matter of fact. Harris winced slightly at the reminder of the harsh reality they were facing. "Yes, it did. But we're going to fix it. I've already reviewed the footage from Reynolds' body cam, and I'm putting him on immediate leave, pending an investigation. We will ensure that this never happens again." His resolve was commendable, but Miles felt a lingering skepticism. Miles raised an eyebrow, a hint of incredulity creeping into his expression. "An investigation, Chief? And what do you expect to find?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Harris shifted uncomfortably but pressed on, determined to address the issue head-on. "I'll be honest. Judge Reynolds messed up. He made assumptions and acted on them without proper judgment, and now we're all dealing with the consequences of those hasty decisions. But I can't just make this disappear. We have to follow protocol, and that means an investigation." Miles watched him intently for a moment, weighing his words carefully. He did not doubt that Harris was sincere in his desire to make things right. But the problem extended beyond Officer Reynolds. It was deeply rooted in the systemic issues that allowed individuals like Reynolds to operate in such a manner without accountability. "You know, Chief," Miles began, his voice thoughtful and measured, "I've spent my entire career working diligently within the system, believing that it could indeed be reformed. I've always held the conviction that if we just followed the rules, if we held people accountable for their actions, we could make it better. But what I'm starting to realize, painfully, is that the system isn't merely broken. It's functioning exactly as it was designed to." Harris frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "I understand your frustration, Judge. Believe me, I do. But I'm doing everything in my power to ensure this doesn't happen again." His sincerity was evident, yet Miles could sense the tension between them. Miles nodded, though there was a sadness reflected in his eyes now, a heaviness that lingered. "I know you are, Chief. But the problem is not just this singular incident. It's the grim reality that it could happen to anyone at any time. No amount of investigations or changes in protocol will truly fix that fundamental issue." Harris fell silent for a moment, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and frustration, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. "What do you want me to do, Judge?" he finally asked, his voice quiet and almost resigned. Miles took a deep breath, contemplating his response before answering thoughtfully. "I want you to listen. I want you to understand that this isn't just about me. It's about every black man and woman who has been stopped, questioned, harassed, or worse, simply because of the color of their skin. I want you to take a hard, honest look at the system you're a part of and ask yourself if it is genuinely serving the people it is meant to protect." Harris met his gaze, and for the first time, the two men seemed to truly understand one another on a deeper level. "I'll do what I can, Judge," Harris said, his voice heavy with the weight of his words. "But change doesn't happen overnight." Miles nodded slowly, his resolve unwavering. "No, it doesn't. But it has to start somewhere." Harris glanced briefly at Jenkins, then back at Miles. "We'll have you out of here soon, Judge. I'm truly sorry this happened." Miles watched as Harris and Jenkins turned to leave, his mind still racing with thoughts of everything that had transpired. He understood that this was not the end. Systemic change wouldn't happen overnight. But perhaps, just perhaps, this incident would spark something. A conversation, a shift in perspective, a moment that would encourage others to take a hard look at the way things were and how they could be improved. As the door closed behind them, Judge Aaron Miles sat back on the bench, alone with his thoughts. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the starkness of the room. Change was slow, but it was possible. And tonight, he had taken the crucial first step in making sure that change began. Judge Aaron Miles stood under the harsh fluorescent lights of the police station, his expression deceptively calm, though inside he felt the familiar mix of anger and frustration simmering just below the surface. The physical weight of the handcuffs had been lifted, but the psychological burden of what had transpired that night pressed heavily on his chest, an unshakable reminder of the injustices that persisted within a flawed system. Sergeant Jenkins had diligently ensured that the paperwork for Judge Miles's release was processed swiftly. Now, just a few hours after what many deemed an unjust arrest, Judge Miles stood poised to leave the police station. However, he had no intention of exiting quietly or without making a statement. This incident represented far more than a mere mistake. It symbolized a broader systemic issue that affected countless other black men and women who, unlike him, did not possess the same status or protection. They could not voice their grievances against the injustices they encountered daily. As Miles surveyed the scene, he noted the palpable tension hanging in the air of the station. Officers moved briskly in and out of the front room, their conversations low and furtive. Each glance cast toward Judge Miles carried an unspoken acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. News of his arrest had spread like wildfire throughout the community, fueled further by video footage captured by bystanders that had already gone viral on social media. The officers, acutely aware of the storm of public outrage that was brewing, braced themselves for the scrutiny that would inevitably follow: investigations, media pressure, and calls for accountability. For many of them, this was uncharted territory. The arrest of a black judge was an event that could not be easily swept under the rug. It was a flashpoint that demanded attention. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 5 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Miles stood resolutely as Police Chief Nathan Harris approached him. The chief had been on a mission of damage control since he arrived at the station, issuing apologies and attempting to navigate the delicate situation with care. Yet, Miles understood that the time for mere apologies had long since passed. The harm inflicted could not simply be undone with a few carefully chosen words. "Judge Miles," Harris began, his voice low, almost imploring. "I fully comprehend the immense difficulty of this experience. I've already spoken to Officer Reynolds about the incident, and I've placed him on administrative leave pending a thorough investigation. I want you to understand that this isn't representative of how we conduct ourselves, and we are taking this matter with the utmost seriousness." Miles met the chief's gaze with an intensity that conveyed both his anger and disappointment. "This is not merely about Officer Reynolds, Chief. This situation extends beyond him. It highlights a system that permits officers like him to operate under the dangerous assumption that individuals like me do not belong. Do you honestly believe I'm the first person he has treated this way? Do you think this is an isolated incident? The first time a black man has been wrongfully arrested in this town?" Harris shifted uncomfortably, his expression betraying the difficulty of the conversation. "We do everything within our power to prevent situations like this from occurring, and yet, here we are." Miles interrupted him, his voice firm yet composed. "Despite your policies, despite the training your officers undergo, despite the various safeguards that are supposedly in place to prevent injustices like this, it still happened. And unless there is a significant change, it will happen again." The chief lowered his gaze momentarily, clearly grappling with how to respond. Miles recognized that Harris wasn't inherently a bad man. Rather, he was enmeshed in a system that had historically exploited black men and women. A system crafted to protect those in power while marginalizing those perceived as outsiders or threats. Harris was just another cog in this machine, as much a victim of its flawed design as the individuals it targeted. "I'm not here to demand that Officer Reynolds lose his job," Miles stated, catching the chief off guard. "Simply firing him won't resolve the issue. You'll just bring in someone new, someone who has been trained in the same flawed system. What I am asking for is genuine accountability and real reform. You must take a long, hard look at your department, at the training protocols for your officers, and at the way they interact with the community. Because if this can happen to me, a judge, no less, imagine the experiences of those who lack the privilege of my title." Harris nodded slowly, clearly absorbing the weight of Miles's words. "I hear you," he said, his voice softening with empathy. "I understand and I agree. We need to improve, but this kind of change won't occur overnight." "I am fully aware of that," Miles replied, his tone measured yet insistent. "However, we are running out of time. You need to act quickly because the world is watching us now. This situation is no longer just about me. This narrative is spreading rapidly, and people are going to demand answers." As if on cue, the front door of the station swung open, and a small crowd of protesters began to gather outside. Many were brandishing signs that articulated their calls for justice, while news vans lined the street, cameras poised and trained on the station, eagerly awaiting the next development. The distant chants of "no justice, no peace" echoed through the air, growing louder as the crowd swelled, their voices a collective expression of outrage and demand for accountability. Chief Harris glanced anxiously toward the door, his expression tight with concern as he contemplated the situation unfolding outside. "The media's already here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to manage this carefully. We can't afford any missteps." Miles stepped closer, his tone firm. "You can't manage this, Chief. You need to own this situation completely. It's crucial to acknowledge what's wrong and take full responsibility for fixing it. If you don't do this now, it will just become another story of injustice, another moment where the system has failed to protect the very people it is supposed to serve." Harris let out a slow, deliberate breath, his mind wrestling with the immense weight of the situation they faced. "We'll be holding a press conference shortly," he replied, his voice tinged with determination. "I'm planning to address the media and the community directly, explain what transpired, and outline the concrete steps we're taking moving forward to rectify this situation." "Good," Miles responded, a sense of urgency creeping into his voice. "But it can't just be words, Chief. People need to see action, real, tangible action that demonstrates a commitment to change." The chief nodded in agreement, but before he could formulate a response, a loud voice from outside pierced the air. "There he is. That's the judge." A throng of reporters had gathered near the entrance, their cameras flashing in rapid succession as they caught sight of Judge Miles standing inside the station. Harris exchanged a quick, knowing glance with Miles, the gravity of the moment settling heavily between them. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miles straightened his tie, a small but determined nod affirming his readiness. "I've been ready for this my whole life," he replied, a fierce resolve shining in his eyes. The two men moved toward the door, and as they stepped outside, the noise from the crowd intensified, a cacophony of voices demanding justice. The protesters, clutching signs emblazoned with powerful slogans like "Stop Racial Profiling" and "Justice for All," quieted momentarily as they recognized Miles and Harris emerging from the station. The air was thick with anticipation and emotion. A collective breath held in the face of uncertainty. Chief Harris stepped forward first, his gaze sweeping over the crowd and the assembled media. His voice, though steady, betrayed a hint of nervousness as he began. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience during this difficult time. I want to start by acknowledging that tonight's incident involving Judge Aaron Miles should never have occurred. It was a clear failure on the part of this department, and for that, I take full responsibility." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the tension palpable as people absorbed his words. "Officer Reynolds has been placed on immediate leave, pending a thorough investigation," Harris continued, his tone resolute. "But I want to make it abundantly clear that this department is committed to transparency and accountability. We will conduct a comprehensive review of our policies, and we will ensure that incidents like this never happen again." A few scattered cheers arose from the crowd, a tentative acknowledgement of his promises, but the majority remained silent, their expressions reflecting skepticism and a yearning for more than just words. Harris turned toward Judge Miles, gesturing for him to take the floor. Judge Miles stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the crowd. He paused for a moment, allowing himself to absorb the sea of faces, black, white, young, old, each one filled with a mix of hope and frustration, all waiting for him to speak, to provide some sense of understanding amid the chaos and injustice they had witnessed that night. "I was reminded of something I've known my entire life," he began, his voice clear and steady, resonating with the weight of his experiences. "No matter who you are, no matter what title you hold, no matter how much you've accomplished, there will always be those who see you as less simply because of the color of your skin." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding their heads in solidarity, while others raised their signs higher, expressing their support. "I stand before you not just as a judge, but as a black man who has experienced firsthand what so many of you face every single day: the fear, the frustration, the anger of being judged not by your actions, but by your appearance. And tonight, I experienced something that far too many people in this country know all too well: what it's like to be treated as guilty before being proven innocent." The crowd began to stir, their voices swelling in volume as they reacted to his powerful words. Some individuals raised their fists high in solidarity, while others shouted in fervent agreement. "This isn't just about me," Judge Miles continued, his voice rising in intensity, carrying a weight that resonated with the sea of faces before him. "This is about every black man, woman, and child who has faced being stopped, questioned, harassed, or subjected to something far worse, all because of the color of their skin. It's about a system that has been built on injustice, a system that protects some individuals while criminalizing others without hesitation." He paused momentarily, allowing the gravity of his words to settle into the minds and hearts of the crowd. A profound silence enveloped the gathering, each person hanging on his every utterance. "I am calling on this department, on this town, and on this entire country to do better. We cannot continue to allow racial profiling and systemic injustice to define our communities. What we need is real reform. We need accountability. We need justice." In response, the crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in a harmonious chorus of support and agreement that filled the air with palpable energy. Judge Miles stood tall, his heart racing with the enormity of the moment. He had dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice, but tonight, he had transcended the confines of the courtroom. He had become a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope in the ongoing struggle for equality and civil rights. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 6 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As the cheers reverberated around him, Judge Aaron Miles recognized that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Change was never an easy endeavor, and the system he was now fighting against was deeply entrenched, its roots woven tightly into the fabric of society. Yet, despite the obstacles that loomed large, he understood that this was merely the beginning. The world was paying attention, and he was ready to lead the charge toward a more just future. The streets of the small town buzzed with renewed energy the morning after the press conference. News outlets from across the nation had descended upon the community, transforming what had once been a quiet, unassuming place into the epicenter of a national dialogue about race, justice, and accountability. The video documenting Judge Aaron Miles's wrongful arrest had gone viral, and his face was now plastered across every major news network. The hashtag Justice for Judge Miles was trending on social media, igniting a firestorm of support and calls for reform that grew louder with each passing hour. Inside his home, Judge Miles sat at the dining table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since turned cold. Sleep had eluded him. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers, all expressing their support, outrage, and solidarity. Some individuals reached out to discuss potential legal action, others sought interviews to share his story, while many simply wanted to express their shared commitment to the movement that had been ignited by his arrest. Yet, amid the outpouring of encouragement, Miles felt a strange sense of stillness wash over him. His mind raced with thoughts of everything that had transpired, but there remained a quiet, reflective part of him that couldn't ignore the deeper implications of what had occurred. He had always been acutely aware of the realities within the system, having spent years observing it from his vantage point behind the bench. However, now he had experienced it firsthand in a way that was undeniable and profoundly unsettling. The front door creaked open, and his wife, Nain, stepped inside, balancing a basket brimming with freshly picked herbs from their garden. She gently set the basket on the counter before walking over to him, her presence a comforting balm. Without uttering a word, she took a seat beside him, her hand resting softly on his arm, a silent show of support. "How are you feeling?" she asked quietly, her voice infused with the tenderness of someone who knew him better than anyone else. Miles exhaled deeply, rubbing his forehead with his free hand as he contemplated her question. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of uncertainty. "I've been reflecting on it all night, everything that has happened. It's surreal, almost like a dream." Nain nodded, her understanding palpable. "I watched the press conference," she said softly, her eyes shining with pride. "You were incredible. The way you spoke. People are listening, Aaron. You're making a significant difference." Miles offered a small, weary smile in response. "I hope so, but I'm genuinely worried that this will just become another story. Another fleeting moment that people discuss for a few weeks before moving on with their lives. I don't want this to fade into obscurity. I want real change." Leaning in closer, Nain locked her gaze with his, her eyes unwavering and filled with conviction. "It won't fade. Not if you keep pushing. You're not just anyone, Aaron. You hold a position that allows you to instigate real change, and people are looking to you to lead the way." Miles contemplated her words. She was right. As a judge, he possessed the power and influence necessary to drive substantial reform within the system. He had the platform, the experience, and now the visibility that came with his newfound prominence. Yet, the question lingered in his mind. Where would he begin? Before he could respond, the sound of his phone buzzing again interrupted their conversation, slicing through the tension in the air. Glancing at the screen, he noticed the familiar name of his longtime friend and fellow judge, Marcus Reed. Reed had been persistent, calling several times over the past few days, but Miles hadn't yet found the time to return his calls, caught up in the whirlwind of the recent events. "Excuse me," he said, stepping into the adjacent living room to answer the call, the phone pressed to his ear as he settled against the wall. "Marcus," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, each word a reflection of the emotional toll he had been enduring. "Aaron, I've been trying to get a hold of you," Marcus responded, his tone urgent yet filled with genuine concern. "Are you okay? I saw the video. I couldn't believe what I was watching." The intensity of his friend's voice indicated just how deeply affected he was by the unfolding situation. "I'm hanging in there," Miles replied, rubbing his temple to alleviate the tension. "It's been a lot, to say the least." He could hear the concern thick in Marcus's voice, a reminder of their long-standing friendship that had weathered many storms. "I can only imagine," Marcus said, his empathy palpable even over the phone. There was a brief pause, a moment of silence filled with unspoken understanding before he continued. "Listen, I've been thinking about everything that's happened. I've been talking to a few people, other judges, legal scholars, community leaders. There's a real opportunity here, Aaron. An opportunity to push for systemic change." Miles's interest was piqued, but uncertainty loomed. "But we need someone to lead it, someone with credibility, with visibility." The weight of responsibility hung in the air between them. "Someone like you," Miles thought, leaning against the wall, contemplating his friend's words. "You're talking about starting a movement," he said slowly, the enormity of the idea dawning on him. "Exactly," Marcus replied, his enthusiasm evident. "This is bigger than just what happened to you. This is about challenging the entire system, about holding law enforcement accountable for racial profiling and excessive force. We've been discussing these issues for years, but now we have momentum. People are angry, they're engaged, and they're ready to act. But they need leadership. They need someone to help them channel that energy into real, tangible change." Miles fell silent for a moment, the gravity of what Marcus was proposing settling heavily over him. He had dedicated his career to fighting for justice from within the confines of the courtroom, but this was an entirely different arena. This wasn't just about a single case or a ruling. It was about taking on an entire system, one that had been built on generations of inequality and injustice. The thought was daunting, yet it felt like a natural progression, a calling he could no longer ignore. "Are you sure I'm the right person for this?" Miles asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I've spent my whole life in the system. I'm part of it. Marcus, how can I lead a movement against something I'm a part of?" The internal conflict was palpable, a battle between his sense of duty and the reality of his position. "You're exactly the right person," Marcus insisted, his voice firm and unwavering. "Because you've seen it from both sides. You know how it works, and you know how it fails. That perspective is precisely what we need right now. You can help bridge the gap between the people and the system. You can push for reforms that will make a difference." Miles closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the weight of Marcus's words to sink in. He could feel the pull of something larger than himself, something that had been building for years, not just within him, but within the nation. The protests, the outrage, and the fervent calls for justice were all part of the same struggle, a cry for change that could no longer be ignored. Now it seemed the spotlight had turned to him, and he felt the responsibility settle on his shoulders. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked after a long silence, sensing the shift in Miles's demeanor. "I'm thinking you're right," Miles said finally, the resolve in his voice strengthening. "I'm thinking that this is bigger than me, and that if I don't do something, I'm missing an opportunity to make real change." The realization sparked something within him, a flicker of determination igniting amid the chaos. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but the chance to lead a movement toward justice felt like a calling he couldn't ignore. There was a noticeable pause on the other end of the line, filled with a mix of anticipation and hope. Finally, the sound of Marcus exhaling in relief broke the silence. "I knew you'd see it that way," he said, his tone brightening. "I've already started reaching out to some key individuals, activists, community leaders, legal experts. We need to gather them all and begin planning, but we must act quickly while the momentum is still strong." "Let's do it," Miles replied, his voice steady and infused with newfound determination. "Let's organize something substantial. We'll start small, but we'll build it into something impactful. We'll push for reform and accountability. We'll challenge this system from the inside out." Marcus's enthusiasm was palpable. "That's the Aaron Miles I know. I'll arrange a meeting with everyone involved. Just let me know when you're ready." "Give me a day," Miles said, I need to talk to my family and sort out some logistics, but I'm all in. After ending the call, Miles stood in the living room for a moment, staring out the window at the peaceful street beyond. The tranquility outside was a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night, but he understood all too well that this peace was fragile. The fight for justice was far from over. It was only just beginning. When he returned to the kitchen, he found Nain still seated at the table, her eyes filled with concern as they met his. "What was that conversation about?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. Miles took a seat beside her, gently clasping her hand in his. "Marcus wants me to lead a movement, one that pushes for meaningful police reform and accountability. He's already reached out to a few individuals who can help organize our efforts." Nain nodded slowly, her gaze searching his face for clarity. "And what do you want from this?" "I want to ensure that this doesn't just fade away into silence," he replied quietly, the weight of his words heavy in the air. "I want to make sure that what happened to me, and to so many others, leads to tangible change, not just in this town, but everywhere." Nain squeezed his hand, her expression softening with understanding and support. "Then you should do it. I know it's going to be a monumental task," he said, his voice thick with uncertainty. "It's going to require immense time and energy, and I'm aware that it will be a fight every step of the way." "I understand," she replied, her voice steady and reassuring. "But if anyone can undertake this challenge, Aaron, it's you. You've devoted your life to fighting for justice. Now it's time to fight for something even larger than yourself." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 7 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. A surge of emotion welled up inside Miles. He hadn't realized just how much he needed to hear those affirming words, nor how deeply he had been doubting himself. But now, as he sat beside his wife, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, he felt a renewed sense of strength and certainty. "Thank you," he whispered, pulling her into a tight embrace. As they sat together in the comforting silence of their home, Miles understood that the path ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. Yet, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt ready. He wasn't merely a judge anymore. He was a man on a mission, committed to ensuring that real justice was achieved, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered. The world had witnessed his arrest. Now, it would bear witness to his fight for change. The energy in the room was electric as Judge Aaron Miles stood at the head of a long conference table, surrounded by a diverse group of activists, legal experts, community leaders, and members of the media. The meeting had been organized swiftly, but the sense of urgency and purpose had drawn everyone with a vested interest in the fight for reform. The conference room buzzed with animated conversations and passionate debates, the air thick with the promise of something larger than any of them could have imagined. Over the past week, the news cycle had been dominated by Judge Miles's wrongful arrest. Footage of Officer Reynolds forcibly pulling him from his car and handcuffing him had played on a continuous loop, becoming a potent symbol of everything that was wrong with policing in America. Outrage had erupted across the nation. Protests had taken to the streets in major cities, and the discourse surrounding racial profiling, systemic injustice, and police reform had reached a fever pitch. Miles had been inundated with media requests, interview offers, and calls from politicians and community leaders eager to express their support. However, this meeting, a gathering of minds and hearts in one room, was where real change could begin. He had spent the past several days preparing for this moment, gathering his thoughts and conferring with key allies like Marcus Reed, who had played an instrumental role in bringing the individuals present today together. Now, as he surveyed the faces around the table, Miles felt the weight of what was at stake. Marcus, seated to his right, leaned in and whispered, "You ready for this?" Miles nodded, though his heart raced in his chest. He was ready, but the enormity of the moment was not lost on him. "I'm ready," he replied softly, determination shining in his eyes. As the conversations in the room gradually began to quiet down, all eyes turned to Judge Miles. He straightened his posture, drawing from a well of inner strength, and spoke with a calm yet purposeful voice that cut through the lingering whispers. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his tone resonating with sincerity. I know that we've all been diligently working toward meaningful change for a long time, but the events of the past week have brought us to a critical tipping point. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It is part of a much larger, systemic problem, one that has been allowed to fester for far too long. And now, we have a unique opportunity to do something about it. Murmurs of agreement echoed from around the table, and Miles could feel the energy in the room shift. People were actively listening and engaged in the moment. For years, we've been discussing police reform, racial justice, and accountability. But too often, those conversations have stalled, trapped in a cycle of promises and inaction. We can't let that happen this time. We have momentum on our side. The public is watching, and we must transform this moment into a powerful movement. Among those gathered, a young community organizer named Maya leaned forward, her expression earnest and determined. She had been at the forefront of protests advocating for police accountability in her community for years, and her frustration was palpable. "We've had moments like this before," she interjected, her voice tinged with skepticism. "After George Floyd, after Breonna Taylor, and after so many others. The outrage builds, people take to the streets, and then, inevitably, it fades. How do we ensure that this time is different?" Miles nodded in understanding, fully aware of her concerns. "You're right. We've seen the pattern all too clearly. But this time, we're not just going to react, we're going to lead the charge. We need to move beyond protests and start advocating for specific, actionable reforms. What we need are enforceable laws and policies, coupled with a unified message that the public can rally around and support." Maya looked thoughtful but remained skeptical. "And how exactly do we achieve that? The system is constructed to protect itself. Every time we've tried to push through meaningful reform, it gets diluted or completely blocked. What's going to make this time any different?" Marcus, another member of the group, leaned in with a sense of urgency. "We've been actively engaging with lawmakers at both local and national levels," he explained. "Our first step is to advocate for a national bill specifically targeting racial profiling, which mandates police departments to implement strict accountability measures. We need body cameras that are used in the field, independent review boards for cases of police misconduct, and a transparent disciplinary process that ensures officers are held accountable for their actions. But it can't just be about passing a single law," Miles added, his tone firm. "This effort is going to require sustained pressure from the public. We must keep this issue in the news cycle to prevent it from being forgotten. That's why we're building a broad coalition of activists, legal experts, community leaders, and, most importantly, individuals directly affected by these injustices. We're going to maintain pressure until we see tangible change." Another voice chimed in, this time from a civil rights lawyer seated across the table. "We also need to be prepared for significant pushback from police unions. They wield substantial power and will fiercely resist any attempt to limit their authority. We've witnessed their tactics before. They'll employ every means at their disposal to undermine reform efforts." Miles's expression grew serious, reflecting the gravity of the situation. "I know that to be true, and we're going to be ready for it. Yes, the unions have considerable influence, but we have the people on our side. We need to make it abundantly clear that this isn't about undermining law enforcement. It's about ensuring that they serve and protect all members of our community, not just a select few. We're not anti-police. We're anti-police brutality. There's a crucial difference, and we need to make sure that message is loud and clear." The room fell quiet for a moment as everyone absorbed the weight of what had just been said. It was evident that the path ahead would not be easy. They were up against a deeply entrenched system that had resisted change for decades, a system designed to shield itself from accountability. Yet, for the first time in a long time, it felt like they had a real chance to create the change they desperately sought. "I've been engaging in deep conversations with families who have suffered unimaginable losses due to police violence," Miles continued, his voice taking on a softer, more empathetic tone. "These families have been relentlessly advocating for justice for years, enduring a relentless cycle of indifference, bureaucratic delays, and outright denial. We must amplify their voices and ensure they are front and center in this movement. This fight isn't merely about changing laws. It's about fundamentally transforming the culture of policing in our country, reshaping it to prioritize accountability and respect for human life. At the end of the table, a woman raised her hand. She introduced herself as Angela, a dedicated community activist with years of experience. "I wholeheartedly agree with everything you're saying," she began, her voice steady and resolute. "However, we must also consider the long-term implications of our actions. If we are truly committed to pushing for these reforms, we need to establish a movement that endures, one that does not hinge solely on a single moment of outrage. What will happen once the laws are passed? How can we ensure that the next generation remains engaged and continues to advocate for meaningful change?" Miles nodded in acknowledgement, recognizing the wisdom in her words. "That's precisely why we are planning to invest in education and outreach initiatives. It is essential to involve young people in this struggle to ensure they comprehend the vital role of civic engagement and activism. We can no longer afford to be merely reactive. We need to adopt a proactive stance, laying down a robust foundation that future generations can build upon." Marcus leaned in, his enthusiasm palpable. "We're discussing the formation of a national coalition, an initiative that can mobilize individuals across the country, not just in reaction to tragic incidents like mine, but as a continuous force keeping pressure on lawmakers to implement reforms at every level, local, state, and national." The atmosphere in the room began to buzz with excitement. People nodded in agreement, exchanging ideas and brainstorming innovative strategies to propel the movement forward. It felt as though a spark had ignited, the flame of passion and determination spreading rapidly among them. Maya, the community organizer, leaned forward, her previous skepticism fading. "If we're going to embark on this journey, we must hit the ground running. We need a compelling name, a clear platform, and a functional website. People need a definitive place to turn to get involved and stay informed." "I've already started laying the groundwork for that," Marcus replied with a confident smile. "We'll have everything established and operational within a week." Miles scanned the table, absorbing the palpable energy and determination radiating from everyone's faces. This was happening. They were in the process of building something tangible, something that could endure. It was no longer solely about what had happened to him. It was about every injustice that had been overlooked, every family that had been denied justice, and every individual who had been made to feel that their life didn't matter. "We must ensure that every voice is heard," Miles asserted, his voice imbued with conviction. "This isn't just my fight. It's our collective fight. We will not rest until we have established a system that is fair, just, and accountable to every member of our community." The room erupted into a wave of applause, a thunderous sound that filled the air with energy and hope. Although the fight for justice was just beginning, Judge Aaron Miles felt a deep conviction within him, a sensation that resonated in every fiber of his being. This was a moment that transcended time, one that would not fade away into obscurity. It marked the genesis of something far greater than himself, a cause that eclipsed the achievements of any single individual. As the meeting progressed, plans were meticulously drafted, tasks were assigned, and strategies were passionately debated. Judge Miles was enveloped by an unprecedented sense of purpose, one that ignited a fire within him like never before. The world had witnessed his wrongful arrest, and in that moment, he was judged not by the authority of his title or the quality of his work, but solely by the color of his skin. Now, however, the world would observe him stepping into a leadership role, spearheading a justice movement, one that would boldly confront and challenge the very foundations of the system that had wronged him. This time, they were resolute. They would not relent until real, meaningful change was achieved. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 8 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. In the months following Judge Aaron Miles's unjust arrest, the movement he had been instrumental in igniting burgeoned into a phenomenon larger than anyone could have ever envisioned. What had initially started as a localized incident in a small town rapidly evolved into a nationwide reckoning, with rallies, marches, and town hall meetings erupting in cities across the country. The coalition that Aaron and his ally Marcus had painstakingly built transformed into a formidable force for change, uniting individuals from diverse backgrounds and experiences under a collective mission to dismantle systemic injustice and demand accountability from law enforcement. Judge Miles, now firmly positioned at the forefront of this movement, had ascended to the status of a household name. His narrative, intertwined with those of countless others who had suffered from racial profiling and police brutality, emerged as a powerful symbol underscoring the urgent need for reform. Major media outlets were keen to cover his every action, and he found himself invited to speak at prestigious universities, influential legal forums, and vital civil rights events. People across the nation were eager to hear his voice, to learn about the next steps, and to discover how they could actively contribute to the change they so desperately sought. Yet, despite the surge of attention and accolades that surrounded him, Aaron remained deeply grounded. He understood that this cause had never been about his own experiences. It was about the countless individuals whose stories had often been drowned out, those whose names never graced the headlines, but who were equally deserving of justice and recognition. He felt a profound sense of responsibility to these individuals, a weight that pressed heavily upon his shoulders. One cool autumn afternoon, Aaron found himself standing resolutely on the steps of the courthouse where he had devoted years of his life to serving justice. He had been invited to deliver a speech during a powerful rally advocating for statewide police reform. As he gazed out over the expansive courthouse square, he was met with the sight of hundreds of passionate individuals gathered together, their signs held high, their voices ringing out with a blend of hope and determination. The atmosphere was a striking contrast to the harrowing scene that had unfolded months earlier when he had been handcuffed on the side of a quiet road, treated as a suspect rather than a respected judge. Standing at the podium, he took a moment to absorb the sea of faces before him, each one reflecting a unique story, a shared struggle, and a collective desire for justice. Aaron stood before the crowd, feeling the immense weight of the moment pressing down on him. This gathering was not just a simple assembly. It was a pivotal opportunity for them all, a chance to be truly heard, to demand accountability from those in positions of power, and to strive for genuine, lasting change that could reshape the fabric of their communities. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice ringing out strong and unwavering. "Thank you not only for showing up today, but for your unwavering commitment every single day since this movement first began. It's because of passionate individuals like you that we've been able to make progress. It's your refusal to remain silent, your relentless determination to stand up and demand justice, that has driven us forward in the face of adversity and denial. Your voices matter, and together we have the power to create a wave of change." As his words echoed through the crowd, an eruption of cheers filled the air, a powerful chorus of voices united in solidarity. Aaron felt the collective energy radiating from the sea of faces before him as he continued. "But we must not forget that we still have a long and challenging road ahead of us." His tone grew serious, and the gravity of his message weighed heavily in the atmosphere. "We've witnessed far too many lives lost, too many families shattered, and too many communities devastated by a system that was ostensibly created to protect them. Officers have walked free after committing heinous acts of violence. Investigations have been delayed or obscured, and we have seen laws passed that prioritize the preservation of power over the protection of the people." As he spoke, waves of murmurs rippled through the crowd, expressions of agreement and shared frustration. "I know you're angry," he declared, his voice rising to match the intensity of the moment. "And let me assure you, I share that anger. But we must not allow our rage to consume us. We must channel it into real, tangible action that leads to meaningful change. That's precisely why we have gathered here today, not merely to ask for reform, but to demand it with every fiber of our being. We stand here together, shoulder to shoulder, ready to raise our voices and make them echo through the halls of power." Applause erupted once again, filling the air with a palpable sense of hope and determination as Aaron declared passionately, "The time for incremental change is over. We require bold, comprehensive reform that addresses the very root causes of this pervasive injustice. We need laws that hold officers accountable for their actions, that ensure transparency in every layer of law enforcement, and that protect the rights of every individual, regardless of the color of their skin. It is not enough to simply reform. We must rebuild a system that truly serves the people." As he scanned the diverse crowd, young and old, black and white, He felt a profound sense of unity among them in their demand for a brighter future. Among them were families who had suffered unimaginable losses due to police violence. Their grief was palpable, yet their resolve remained unshakable. He had met many of them in the past, listening intently to their heartbreaking stories and sharing in their sorrow. Their faces were etched with pain, but also with hope, the hope that their struggles would not be in vain. "We've made significant progress," Aaron said, his tone a blend of hope and determination. "But we cannot stop here. We must continue to push forward, ensuring that this moment transforms into a sustained movement that will endure for generations to come. Each step we take today must lay the groundwork for a future where our children can live without fear of violence, where every citizen is treated with respect and dignity." At the edge of the crowd, he spotted Maya, a dedicated community organizer known for her fierce advocacy for police reform. Her encouraging nod reminded him that he was not alone in this fight, that together they could make a profound difference. Her presence gave him strength, a reminder that the movement was built on the collective efforts of many passionate individuals. "We've seen the power of coming together," he continued, his passion igniting the crowd's energy further. "Across the country, we have witnessed laws being enacted that ban chokeholds, mandate the use of body cameras, and create independent oversight of police departments. But let's be clear, those laws are just the beginning. We need to fundamentally reimagine what public safety looks like, creating a system that truly works for everyone, not just for a privileged few. This isn't just about policing. It's about justice, equity, and creating a society where every person can thrive." The crowd cheered again, their enthusiasm further fueling his determination. "For far too long, the system has operated without accountability, but we are here to change that. We are standing up to hold those in power accountable, and we won't stop until every community is safe, not just from crime, but from those who are sworn to protect them. We deserve a system that is built on trust, transparency, and respect." He paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to resonate deeply within the hearts of those gathered. "Today, we gather not only to remember the lives lost, but to honor their memories by fighting for a future where no one else has to experience such profound pain. We demand that our voices be heard and that the broken system which has failed so many be reformed and revitalized." As the applause roared around him, Aaron stepped back from the podium, allowing the next speaker to take the stage. Marcus, a close friend and ally, joined him, clapping him on the back with a proud grin. "You were brilliant, Aaron. This is just the beginning of what we can achieve together." "It's bigger than just me now," Aaron replied, feeling the weight of the moment settle more heavily on his shoulders. "This is everyone's fight. This is about all of us standing together and demanding change. We must uplift one another and continue to advocate for justice and equity." Marcus nodded in agreement, his expression serious. "Exactly. It's not merely about one case, one individual, or even one movement. It's about changing the entire system for good, ensuring it serves all of us equally and justly. We're here to dismantle the structures that perpetuate injustice and build something better in their place." As the rally continued to unfold, Aaron and Marcus stepped away from the crowd, taking a moment to observe the media frenzy that surrounded them. Reporters shouted questions, eager for sound bites and headlines, but Aaron felt that he had already delivered his message. Now, it was time to focus on the substantial work that lay ahead. "Do you think they'll listen?" Marcus asked quietly, a hint of doubt creeping into his voice, reflecting the uncertainty that many felt. "They will have to," Aaron replied with a steely resolve. "We're not giving them a choice. The voices of the people are too powerful to ignore any longer. They can't silence us. We will keep speaking out until they have no choice but to listen." In the weeks that followed, the movement gained remarkable traction. Lawmakers faced mounting pressure to act decisively on police reform. Bills were introduced nationwide, many of which were modeled after proposals drafted by Aaron and his coalition. The media coverage was relentless, highlighting the public demand for change and showcasing the stories of those affected by systemic injustices. Town halls were filled, and protests spread like wildfire, with people from all walks of life joining in solidarity. However, Aaron understood that the real work had only just begun. It wasn't sufficient to merely pass laws. They needed to be enforced rigorously, and that would require vigilance and advocacy. More importantly, the very culture of policing needed to undergo a fundamental transformation, a monumental challenge that loomed ahead. It meant confronting deeply entrenched beliefs and practices that had persisted for far too long. One evening, after a long and grueling day of meetings and strategy sessions, Aaron found himself sitting alone in his office, his gaze fixed on the framed photographs of his family lining the shelves. Each picture told a story, a reminder of the love and support that had fueled his determination. His life had been irrevocably shaken by recent events, and he contemplated the world his children would inherit. Would they grow up in fear of those who were meant to protect them? Or would his tireless efforts help forge a safer, more just future for all? Would they inherit a world filled with hope, one marred by violence and fear? In that moment of deep reflection, he realized that this fight wasn't solely about his journey. It was about the future he envisioned for his children and for generations to come. It was about creating a world where all children could grow up without fear, where they could feel safe in their neighborhoods and trust those who wore the badge. And that was a cause worth fighting for, no matter how long it took or how challenging the path ahead might be. With a renewed sense of determination, Aaron rose from his desk, ready to face the challenges ahead. He felt a surge of energy coursing through him, a renewed sense of purpose that pushed him forward. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a genuine sense of hope. A hope not just for himself, but for the world they were collectively building, step by step, brick by brick. The fight for justice was far from over, but he was prepared to stand at the forefront, leading the charge toward a brighter, more equitable future. As we reflect on Judge Aaron Miles' harrowing experience, we're reminded of the pervasive issues of bias and injustice that still exist today. This story challenges us to examine our perspectives and the importance of empathy in our interactions with others. What have you learned from Judge Miles' encounter? Share one takeaway that you'll put into practice in your own life in the comments below. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.